Welcome to this discussion on economic concerns and narratives, from distraction to dialogue. I'm Yasmina Brankovic, a research associate with the Institute for Integrated Transitions. This event is hosted by IFIT's online narrative peacebuilding hub, which provides a wealth of resources like papers, videos, practice briefs, toolkits on integrating narrative as a key component of peacebuilding. The hub is the work of IFIT's Inclusive Narratives Practice Group and our country teams. We are continually developing approaches for transforming narratives at scale in societies affected by polarization and conflict. In the video from our last online event on elections and narratives, which you can find on the hub, our Inclusive Narratives Practice Group colleague Solon Simmons talked about how narratives around identity have eclipsed discussions about class and degrees of access to housing, education, health, and so forth in many countries. He noted that this has not happened by accident, but rather is often a narrative strategy, which serves to distract from concrete issues and grievances. Also, in one of our discussion papers on the hub on influential actors and narratives, we talk about economic power and how narratives are used to increase or secure it. Always important, narratives and popular perceptions of the economy have been a key issue amid the elections, crises, and conflicts we've faced worldwide over the past year or so. So to discuss this, we're joined by three distinguished members of IFIT's community of experts. Let me introduce Sara Cobb, a narrative theorist and professor emerita at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution and a member of the Inclusive Narratives Practice Group. Godfrey Kanyenze, the founding director of the Labor and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe and a member of our Zimbabwe Resource Group. And Alexandre Marc, conflict transformation specialist and the former World Bank chief specialist for conflict, fragility, and violence, and also a member of the Inclusive Narratives Practice Group. So given that you as panelists have expertise in these different disciplines and regions, I'd just like to ask you to share your views on the relationship between the economy and narratives and how this can contribute to polarization and conflict. Sara, please, let's start with you.
Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to everybody's comments and conversation afterwards. Let me start by saying I wanted to clarify my perspective. I am a researcher, a narrative researcher, but also a practitioner. So I can work at more, let's say, local and regional levels with groups that are concerned about the way narratives are impacting them and wanting to alter that. I've worked for organizations and governments and community organizations, et cetera. So that's a little bit on my background. Now, I read a book that knocked me down called Narrative Economics by a guy named Schiller. And he wrote this book in 2020. So my comments are going to be derived from some of the language that he uses, which I found so pertinent and might be helpful today. Basically, he argues that my notes are in this direction, so I'm not ignoring you. I'm making sure I'm in line with my notes. He argues that the economy is narrative. It's not like we have narratives about the economy as though it's separate. The economy is a narrative or a set of narratives. In fact, he talks about it as a constellation of narratives. And these are anchored in people's personal experiences and in histories, and they're circulated in social networks, right? And they provide scripts for action. What do we do? Do we buy or sell? Do we save or spend? Do we protest? Do we hide? Do we, put chicken coops in our backyard when the cost of eggs goes up? And I wanted to use these examples. I wanted to use a couple of examples of how these narratives are basically existing in constellation, with a case study of the protests in Colombia of 2021, and also with a recent election in the United States. Now, there was a paper written on that case study by Alison Castell, as the lead author and the heavy lifter. Let me tell you, she did most of the work. Jolly Sultanli and myself were also part of that project. And she explored the constellation of narratives as a resulting from the increase of tax policies in Colombia tax reform of 2021. And indeed, there were a constellation of narratives about that tax reform. It was intended to increase the tax on the wealthy, but it added taxes on food and utilities, which really hit hard people at lower levels of income. So there were protests in the street of urban and rural folks. There was strikes across the country. And then the government's response to that was violence. And people were very concerned about the growing level of violence and the potential for that to get out of hand. And indeed, some people were harmed. So this constellation there was not just the two parties. It was also, telling their story about law and order versus, economic viability. It included stories about the peace referendum, about the history of violence in Colombia, about the stories that the local people told about the government in general. So this was a bunch of intersecting stories. And I think we need to see economic issues as a set of intersecting stories. Now, if we look at the U.S. election, something different I think we can see there. And that is there's some internal and external stories. So internal to the Republican Party, we have a story about, I don't know, because I'm not a Republican, likely it's something like, let's increase our money by reducing taxes on the wealthy, because most of these people are, have already got a lot of money. And let's reduce government and let's increase the freedom of corporations and businesses to do what they want to do. So a deregulation sort of a story. And but on the outside, the story that they've told the American public is basically what Schiller calls a contagious story. And these are stories about villains, right, and victims. And the story that they tell is that immigrants are, costing us too much money. And the Biden administration is responsible for the downturn in the economy. And in fact, we had, the real facts are entirely different, but that's the story they told. And these Schiller points out that these narratives are extremely contagious. So I think that in summary, I'd want to say that I believe we can use this language about narrative constellations, about narrative contagion, and the way in which those stories are going to be productive of villains and victimizers and productive of conflict. So those are some of my thoughts on how we can begin to understand the relationship between the economy and narrative.
Thank you, Sara. Godfrey, please go ahead.
Thank you so very much. It's a real honor and pleasure to be part of this distinguished discussion. My take is basically from a political economy perspective. I'll look at the narratives, especially with respect to Southern Africa, as informed largely by the history, the colonial history, the legacy of protracted liberation in Southern Africa, as a result of the unique experience that Southern Africa had of settler, because unlike other parts of Africa, Southern Africa had a settler type of colonialism, where colonial capital captured a small segment of the labor force, around 20%, and left the majority blacks in subsistence agriculture, mainly women, basically, and children. So basically, as a result, Southern Africa went through a protracted struggle and was probably one of the last region in Africa to be independent. Zimbabwe got its independence in 1980, Namibia 1990, and South Africa much later in 1994. Basically, as the result of the tensions, the contradictions, in the sense that colonial capital had established a relatively modernized and developed diversified economy. But however, that modernized economy coexisted with a relatively underdeveloped economy, subsistence economy, the home of the majority black population. So basically, the economy that evolves in Southern Africa is one basically characterized by one built on the basis of an ideology of white supremacy, characterized by the exclusion of the majority and marginalization of the majority blacks, and especially women, who basically encountered the triple sort of disadvantage apart from the racial discrimination. The patriarchal aspects also came into play. So at independence, basically Southern Africa, unlike other parts of Africa, had a dual economy, a relatively developed modern economy coexisting with a relatively backward economy where the majority of the Black people lived. So basically the economic narratives, especially around independence, the concerns and grievances around independence were informed by the need of the liberation parties basically to create a much more just and equitable economy, an inclusive economy, a much more democratic and inclusive governance. So basically that was the major sort of narrative that emerged as a result of the dual and enclave economies of Southern Africa that were edged out of the ideology of white supremacy. So basically, after independence, whilst initially the governments generally in Southern Africa experimented with state interventionist policies, but however, they were soon to abandon that approach because they encountered the usual problems of high budget deficits, etc. And the international financial institutions came in to tutor the governments in post-independence Southern Africa on how to properly manage their economies. And basically, as a result, they became captive to the neoliberal approach, where instead of the transformative agenda, which was so critical during the liberation struggle, the new post-independence economic narrative was on, let's first of all stabilize our economies, grow our economies, and everything else will fall in place, the so-called trickle-down sort of theory. And in much of Southern Africa, most of the governments later on implemented economic structural adjustment programs at the behest of the IMF and World Bank. These were very, very unpopular and basically opposed to the very opposite of the economic narratives of the liberation struggle. So as a result of the implementation of these programs, neoliberal programs, austerity programs, basically there was an entrenchment of inequality, unemployment, unprecedented levels of unemployment. If you look at the most industrialized country in Africa, South Africa, unemployment rates are over 32%. Namibia, unemployment of 37%, youth unemployment of close to 50%. So basically, these are economies that have excluded, by and large, the majority of the population, mainly women, children, persons with disability, and generally the Black population. So it meant, therefore, that there was continuity with the inequitable structure where the majority Blacks were left out of the economy. But unfortunately, as a result of the implementation of these neoliberal policies, in particular, the liberalization of trade and the entry into the global economy on the basis of these market-oriented policies, that resulted across the board in deindustrialization. So we've seen the countries that were at a high level of diversification, like South Africa, Zimbabwe, rapidly being deindustrialized and informalized. If I can use the example of my country, Zimbabwe, more recently in 2019, 76% of all jobs were informal. Fast forward 3 years later, by 2022, 88% of all jobs were informal. So we've seen wrenching structural regression, which has created a lot of inequality, a lot of poverty, and the missing middle. Basically, the middle class was destroyed. If you look at South Africa, the issue of state capture emerges, elites capture the state, and basically the levels of corruption, the levels of illicit activities. If you look at Africa, part of the challenge that we have as a continent is that close to 90 billion US dollars is actually going out of the continent in terms of illicit outflows. So basically, the neoliberal approach has entrenched the enclave and unequal development that characterized the colonial era. And unfortunately, the liberation parties post-independence adopted a narrative that says start with stabilization, adopt austerity to achieve that stabilization, grow your economy. And once you do that, everything will fall in place. But that cannot happen without empowerment, without deliberate interventions. That's why right now South Africa is the most unequal country where 10% of the population owns 80% of the wealth. 4 out of the 10 most unequal countries in the world are actually from Southern Africa, which ironically, paradoxically, is the most diversified part of Africa. So in essence, as a result of the adoption of these neo-colonial, neoliberal policies, that has basically resulted in a departure from the narrative, economic narrative of structural transformation, of inclusion, of freedom, because governments now, in order to enforce those economic policies, they had to queen repression with austerity. So you can imagine queening austerity with the repression, what concoction you get. As a result, that's why we've seen a pushback in such a manner that in countries like Malawi, in Zambia, and recently in 2024, Botswana, the liberation parties have lost elections. And in South Africa, for the first time, the African National Congress in 2024 lost its majority and to actually form a government of national unity. And post-elections in 2024 in Mozambique, we've also seen riots, instability, as a result, basically, of the lack of inclusion of the majority of the Black population.
Okay, thank you, Godfrey, for that. Alexandre, please, can I turn to you?
Yes, so it's a great pleasure to be here also and to see again Sara on we haven't seen for a very long time, I think. So I want to say a few things. Actually, I'm going to build on the very, very interesting comments of Sara and look a little bit at how the economic issues are playing in our today's in the polarization, because I'm really very much looking these days at the polarization issues and polarization that can lead to civil war. So topics of economy are present in narratives, as Sara said, that lead to conflicts and violence in all sorts of forms. They can be very primary topics, they can be secondary topics, or they can even be hidden preoccupation that are hidden in the roots of narratives. But I would here say that it's very rare that pure economic issue leads to polarization. You need other elements to actually polarize the society. And so first, I think when we talk about narrative, leading to conflict, we must distinguish two things. First, we must distinguish a situation where people hold grievances against the states, or situation where the society is divided between groups with different views, with one side holding grievances against the other sides. These are different situations. I would say the second situation gives you much more intricate problems and leads very often to civil war. The first one can lead to revolution. So a good example of the first one is the Carnation Revolution in 2010 in Tunisia, that started the Arab Spring, and that was a revolt around the regions where economic grievances were central. The governments fell, but there was no polarization in society. Everybody was agreeing that the government was not working. Polarization came much later in Tunisia and the other countries when other issues come into play, like the issue of identity, Islam, and especially the tenets of laicity and Islamism. So a situation of strong polarization inside the society that can lead to civil war, in my view, needs something much more emotional than just a sense of economic hardship. In fact, it was what Sara said. You need three elements to bring those emotions up when you have an economic hardship situation. First, you need a strong sentiment of injustice vis-à-vis another group. So you need this sentiment of injustice. Then you bring an element of identity, and especially cultural identity in there, and especially group identity. Because I refer there to the work of Francis Stewart, who talked about horizontal inequality, saying that those horizontal inequality, that means base group inequality, was what leading the most frequently to conflict. So we need first a sense of injustice, a sense of identity, and a sense of group and identity. And so what you see very often is a shift from a purely problem economic that shifts to bring those other more emotional issues in the narratives, whether the issues are true or not, saying that one group is benefiting from the fact that my group is losing. So another group is benefiting from the fact that my group is losing. And then this can be for issue, for example, of favor, corruption, racism. And then the level starts to goes up and people start to get very angry against one group against the other. And that's what you need for polarization. It's not enough just to say that I'm unhappy with the economy. So the more shift involves group identity, the more you have a chance to increase polarization. So narrative with all often shift to identify issues to feed polarization. And you need to find people responsible. You need to, in this identity, you have to find another one that is responsible to what happens to you. So the most common shift, for example, you have an economic problem, and then suddenly it becomes the problems of the migrant. That's one thing that you see everywhere today. And sometimes there are issues, but very often those issues are completely overblown. Or a minority, right? The problem is the minority, because just saying that I have an economic grievance, an economic issue is not enough to be able to create the strong polarization. So you see in the narrative this shift happening, and how this shift is formed that is very important. But we can also happen that shift can happen both ways. That's what is interesting. You have case where identity comes first and then an economic problems come and feed on it. So there's a very interesting book that has been written recently on the US that's called Why We're Polarized by Ezra Klein. Now, in this book, he says that many research have shown that the situation of grievances around low level of economic development by uneducated white came actually at the origin because the whites were actually seeing the black and the black and the Latino doing better than themselves. And then they realize that they have a problem. So it can also go, and then the narrative has to build up that the others were actually benefiting much more of the system than they were. So it was turned into a group issue. So it became emotional, and then it fed very strongly in the polarization. So price rise, for example, in the last election in the US is very interesting how it played out, where you had a price rise that was affecting everybody, but suddenly for once the price rise was the issue, and for the others the unemployment was something positive. So you suddenly used the economic issue and you divided it in two, with the price rise affecting one people and the other the unemployment being very low being seen as a result of positive development. So that's just what I want to say. I want to say that you need this shift to happen on much more emotional issue. An economic issue by themselves might not be sufficient to create strong polarization.
Thank you so much, Alexandre. And thank you all for these different analyses of, the problem. So now, can I ask you to share with us some strategies for addressing, these narrative dynamics, and also for encouraging collaboration that could yield some broad benefits? Sara, could we start with you again?
Certainly. Well, in the face of the richness of Godfrey and Alexandre's comments, it's hard to imagine strategies that are going to work across all contexts everywhere. But I had three examples that I wanted, just three kinds of things that I thought would be interesting. One is a story about what happened in Colombia, going back to the tax reform of 2021. In Cali, which is a community there in Colombia, rather than the violence increasing and the strike continuing, people came together at dialogue tables around this in the area. And there were diverse participants. There were business people, which often sit out, and more militant youth, would be occupying those spaces. But in fact, the militant youth were there with the businesses, with government officials, with local NGOs, and other kinds of organizations that were part of the community. So, including religious conversations. So it was a really diverse group, and that was extremely effective. So one of the things that this made me think about was in cases of crisis, and I think we have those everywhere in the stories that Godfrey was telling and the examples that Alexandre was giving. How could we, in some of these places, it's not local, it's national or global, and so it makes it more difficult to have sort of dialogue tables. But I think it's one opportunity. The second is an example driven by the publication of our Vice President, Vance, his book, Hillbilly Elegy. And that raised an entire conversation across the country about the opioid crisis and about the impoverished communities in Appalachia. And because it made it real for all of us, and it was, brought to the fore. So I think the stories of economic pain, these micro stories, the stories that make it personal, are really, really so much more important in terms of building understanding and bringing people together and creating opportunities for change, and addressing some of the injustice of, like, for instance, neoliberal policies through the circulation of these personal stories. The third thing I was going to mention is that I think our policies are themselves, if you look at the tax reform in Colombia of 2021, and it's just a good example, there's nothing in there that's personal. There's nothing in there that's human. It's all about numbers. It's all about this lever or that lever, and this is supposed to produce these outcomes. There's no people in it. So what I would suggest, the third thing, would be for us to study better ways of writing economic policy that would be driven by kind of MINI, small stories about what these policies are intended to do, because they live in the world of numbers, and we live in the world of stories. So those were the three things that I thought, just examples of things that we might be doing that would help us support changes in economic policies that would be, more productive, as Godfrey was saying, for addressing marginalized populations and for producing more just society. Thank you.
Well, thanks for those very practical ideas. Godfrey, please.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'll be very brief, Jasmina. I will agree with Sara that probably the starting point are dialogues. We've seen that in Southern Africa, difficult circumstances were actually resolved through dialogue. Most of the independence actually came through very difficult processes of dialogue. Look at South Africa in the early parts of the 1990s, when the whole country was about to implode and there were threats of violence. However, dialogue actually brought everyone together so that they could come up with the win-win outcomes. We have seen it also in Zimbabwe. These dialogues can take place at various levels, at community level, at the sector level, at national level. For instance, in Zimbabwe right now, the churches have started a dialogue process. They call it the National Convergence Platform. They're trying to promote convergence amongst divergent sort of views. So I think this is quite important. Political dialogue, especially inclusive dialogues, targeting women, targeting youth, targeting persons with disability, ethnic minorities, and other sort of excluded groups, so that the dialogue process itself is as inclusive as possible. And I think what is also very critical from experience is that there has to be dialogues about dialogues. Before you get into the dialogues, you have to discuss about the format of these dialogues, etc. And lastly, what I think is also critical is to undertake stakeholder and power analysis. Who has got the power? How do they make how do they exercise that power? In whose interest are they using that power? What are the key stakeholders that basically have got a stake so that when you do basically the planning of the dialogues, especially the national dialogues, you ensure that they are as inclusive as possible, essentially leaving no one behind.
Wonderful, thank you. Alexandre, to you.
So I think what you need when you have an economic issue is actually focus on this economic issue early on. If there's something bothering people around the economy, what you have to intervene is before you start to have building up in the narrative this shift that goes into identity, injustice, and other element. The problem is that it goes very often fast, or sometimes is already there. So it's very difficult. But by putting the practical economic issue on the table and try to see how you solve it, and not focus on the problem is because this other group has created that to me. But how do you resolve the actual problem I have now? That's, I think, how you get out of this problem of shift in narratives that will get you, once it gets you into cultural identity and injustice, is practically impossible to get out of. So let me take very briefly an example, and that we're obviously, by just citing the example, you will know that we were not successful, but I think it's an interesting example, is the issue of Ukraine and Russia. So 20 years ago, we were working there, and at the moment, the real issue was in the zones bordering Ukraine and Russia, that the pensioner had a feeling that their pension was much lower, the Russian pensioner, the Russian-speaking pensioner, not the Russian pensioner, than the ones on the other side of the border. And that was really bothering people. And there was unemployment, and there was, because Ukraine had much less means to resolve those problems than Russia. And therefore, the problem was you couldn't resolve and increase the pension rapidly. But what you could do is try to bring this issue and says, okay, what do we do to try and resolve this problem before you start to say, well, this is a problem because it's the Ukrainians from the other side, the one that were Eastern, who don't want us to have the same level of pension than the Russian and all that, all what happened, because these were people from the Donbas region. So the problem is then we moved relatively rapidly with the government, with government support, into trying to do something for this region specifically and try to focus very much on the day-to-day problems of the people. Unfortunately, it was already too late, but because already people had the sense that the people of Ukraine, that were the Ukrainian speaker, didn't want to put more money in those people who were Russian speaker and who were not the ones that had supposed to be benefited more than others. And so you very quickly had this issue shifting to nationalistic issue and identity issue. What is very interesting as a comparison, because I was always saying then after this experience that where there will be trouble and there will be a war, where will the pensioners have a lower pension, the Russian-speaking pensioner have a lower pension than the Russian-speaking pensioners. And that happened in the sense that it was Moldova and Ukraine where this was very clear, where the conflict really spread very quickly. In the Baltic country, didn't, because the pensioners were actually much better off, the Russian-speaking pensioners. They were unhappy, there were many problems, but they had a much more of a stake in staying in their country. So you can see how there it was unsuccessful, but you can see how the economic issue work in this polarization element. Once you're not effective enough to solve the problem immediately, then you have very quickly this shift in narratives, and then it becomes much, much more complicated to resolve.
Well, these have all been really fascinating, useful remarks. I mean, for me, the discussion has really highlighted the importance of sharing different kind of experiences from different regions and countries, and also the value of a kind of multidisciplinary approach to resolving these types of complex challenges, especially when they have to do with narratives, because narratives shape all of our worldviews, so much shape our understandings of ourselves and of others and of society. So thank you to the panelists again for taking part in this discussion.